Hi,
Hi.
Robert Ford, the director of the Heritage Private School. I wanted to address our viewers. We are already 2 years into this podcast, which is quite surprising because we just fired it up like without any plans. And now, look, we have our first podcast in English, which is a challenge for me and also a very interesting proposition about discussing exciting new things with an Englishman. So where are you from?
Well, as you say, from England, and it's an honour to be the person giving the interview for the first English podcast. So I'm from the UK. My family, like with all cultures, we straddle borders from Wales, from England. I count myself as being European. I find myself increasingly that I'm a Moldovan. I'm proud of my adopted country, but yeah, I'm at heart an Englishman.
So even if Brexit happened, you're considering yourself still a citizen of the European.
Well, even the Brexiteers said it was a political thing, not a geographical thing or a cultural thing. Although we know that wasn't quite the case. Absolutely. I mean, I don't see the false dichotomy between a nationality or an identity. You can be both English, Welsh, British, European, global citizen, and I think that kind of mentality is perhaps a bit more for the 21st century than closing ourselves down into our very local identities. But Brexit's been a very interesting experiment in people feeling fearful of a global society, a global world, trying to understand some of the bigger movements that don't recognize borders or nationalities or languages. And you can understand on one level why people are frightened of what is bigger than their education or their understanding, but we also know the very positive sides of this as well.
Do you think that it's just because of the overwhelming level of information that we are getting from the internet and the media?
Well, I'm not sure the statistics I would be quoting now, but we both know that in the 18th century, even intelligent people would be getting thousands of pieces of information on an annual basis. We're receiving tens of thousands of pieces of information on a daily basis, processing that. We know that there's a problem with verification of the truth, of what is reliable, what isn't. I think being a global citizen or a citizen of anywhere in the 21st century can be overwhelming when trying to make sense of a world, and perhaps you can almost understand why people go within and try to find more simpler explanations or situations, or whilst somebody with a good charisma or access to how many influencers now, is it 30,000, but people with several million followers can push a message that a politician in the old days or a philosopher couldn't have quite the same reach. Selling a few hundred books would have been seen as an achievement, and that's dwarfed into the sort of the absolute explosion of how much is published. There's a magazine in the UK which for education, which actually is very famous. It's about 100 years old. It's called the TES, Times Educational Supplement. They've just stopped their print edition. And it's those little moments in life when we're straddling the analog age into the digital age in sort of my generation, where you sort of see those big shifts in the way that our societies are forming now.
How do you still filter your news in this tumult of, of publications?
I think, especially in education, where you're trying to teach children and students how to find news sources and how to find reliable news stories and sources, I think there are still some very good go-to publications that have had a global reach for a long time, and I would always recommend Time Magazine, The Economist, things like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian in the UK. I think those publications have been very successful in how they've embraced the move away from print into social media, the way that they verify stories more. But again, balancing with that, we know that there's media we would never have heard of even a few years ago. We saw that in the US, Breitbart. We see that with the way that news has shifted from information. I mean, the old BBC, their motto was to entertain, to educate, and to inform. And we see now something like Fox, which is purely a right-wing bias. There's not even an attempt to offer a balance to a story. And so trying to get people to sort of, sort out what is fact, because everybody, can go to the internet, they can Google, they can find a source, a piece of information, and trying to get the validity of that is a real skill. And I think that's tied to making sure that people are taught how to be critically aware and to critically think. And that's not to kind of suggest that somebody, we all know, Karen from Facebook is a well-known phenomenon now of how people decipher what is truth and what isn't. But I do think there's a sort of a need to get back to some kind of respect for kind of intellectual process, for understanding that deep knowledge doesn't come by picking up 5 stories because you swipe left when you're in the bathroom in the morning as you're trying to sort of digest so much news. But I do think one of the hardest things we have, and in education in particular, is this sort of information overload. And we see that where people don't read to the depth that they used to, or everything's got to be into several minutes worth, and that's been lost in the way I think we're developing our intellects and developing our own sense of worth. We're living in a very sort of, I think it was the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm. So the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, he talked about the permanent present, and what he implied by that is that we aren't connected to past, we're not looking at historical events, we're fearful of the future, so we don't really contemplate planning for the future, and we see that with climate change situation now. COP26 was a complete failure for many people. It didn't achieve the 1.5 reduction, aim to get 1.5% temperature climate change. And instead we're living in a kind of existentialist now. We want to try and enjoy the now and not worry about. And I think that's what we're seeing with the age we're in. And a lot of the information and a lot of the sort of the entertainment or the social media is very narcissistic. It's very around sort of image, and it's sort of disconnecting us from what would have been a world where people would have actually wanted to experience and immerse themselves more and have a thirst for knowledge and a thirst for learning. And I feel that certainly with this notion of narcissism, that it was Andy Warhol who said about the 15 minutes of fame, that everybody could be an influencer, everybody has something valid to say, and they probably do. But at the same time, we go back to the sort of the age of Karen from Facebook about who do we respect, who are the true giants we should be learning from, whose knowledge should we be passing on, how do we sort of make that wisdom for our own understanding. And I think that's a real challenge, because in education, I'll come back to education, that's what I know best. When we're looking at what we should be doing with children and young people, what skills are we giving them? What knowledge are we giving them? What futures are we preparing them for? A teacher that's teaching that was trained 20 or 30 years ago, that's a really difficult challenge to get somebody who's going to be having a career in social mobility 20 or 30 years from now. And we've seen the transformation and the rapid transformation in the digital age of the last few years and decades. So it is a big challenge.
From what I gather, it would be great as to learn as to triangulate our information, because I have 2 thoughts on this topic. The first one is that just look at the mass media that's credible, and just take the same news and try to empathize with the author's standpoint, but also to take into consideration the other media. And learning this skill is probably what allows you right now to understand or separate what's credible from what's not. But nevertheless, I wanted to explore your background. Sure. And from probably when you started studying yourself, and where did you work before, and how did you get to Moldova? I want to know this timeline.
The journey to Moldova. Yeah. Well, I am keeping a blog called Mail from Moldova, but my home village in England is actually called Madeley. So I have thought Madeley to Moldova as the journey. I'm actually the first in my family to go to university. So for me, education has a real importance in my story and why I'm so involved and why I see the power and the transformative power of it. So my father was a coal miner. He worked underground for 35, 40 years. And I mean, it doesn't exist. Industrial manual labor like this doesn't exist, and it is a real sort of link with history. A piece of coal to sort of light a fire in a house or whatever. And he gave his sunlight up. I mean, I was told this story many times. He gave his sunlight up for his children. So because he was underground in the winter, underground in the summer. I'm one of five. My school was remarkable, and it's only when I look back, John Dewey said, to actually really understand experience, you have to reflect on experience. The experience itself isn't going to give you what you need, the wisdom. And I have reflected on this a lot about my school as I've worked in schools and led schools. And we had really passionate teachers, loved their subject, would challenge students, engage. We actually had a really well-equipped school in a state system. It wasn't a private school. We know that everyone thinks that education in England looks like Hogwarts and Harry Potter. I actually, as you know, I've told you this before, I was actually the principal of the Harry Potter school, Wydene, where she was the student a long time ago. I had Dumbledore's office, so there's a strange link to my career and my progress and journey there. I went to a remarkable university. I went to the University of York in the north of England. It was a very historical city. It always seems it's effortless as you kind of go through your CV and resume on these things. And of course, there were challenges. I felt that I was out of my depth on so many occasions because in the UK, England in particular, we have quite a class-ridden society, and it still exists now, no matter what people say based on accents, not so much or necessarily income, but certainly culture, certainly how an English person speaks. We will determine all sorts of opinions on these things. And so to kind of socially climb or socially mobilize through this territory was a difficult job, and actually deciding what it was you wanted to be. I always loved reading, and I was very fortunate in my hometown in Madeley in Shropshire. There was an amazing library, and you forget, we talk about modern centres of media and learning and sort of information, but actually the library, going back to, I guess, Alexandria and the sort of ancient Greek times and Egyptians, these were and are centres of powerful sort of learning and centres of knowledge and information. And actually I realise now that spending Saturdays in that library and soaking up that library and reading books and having good teachers that could direct you into what to read, or that they would suggest to read something because it was their story, but they wasn't imposing it on me directly. And I had a great teacher, a guy called Les Jones, who's still alive, nicely retired in beautiful Welsh mountains, and he's a real polymath. He was a painter, he was an economist, he was a teacher, a farmer. And this incredible teacher who'd been to Oxford as well, been to Magdalen College, he was really influential in how I was shaped. I always wanted to be a sort of outward-facing global citizen. I didn't know those were the words back then, but I was always engaged. I was always fascinated when a foreign school came to our part of the world, French, German. And in terms of being able to sort of see that internationalism, my father was actually a trade union leader. He was, and in 1984, they went on strike in the UK, the miners, against Margaret Thatcher. It was a very bitter industrial dispute, lasted for a year, and my father was out on strike for a whole year. And during this time, and I don't know if this is where my fascination with the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union came from, but we had a lot of support from coal miners in the Soviet Union, from France. And I remember these food parcels being sent to us as striking sort of miners' families. I also had a very seminal moment in my life because during the summer, we were sent to go and stay with nice sort of middle-class socialist families in London who wanted to do their bit to support the striking miners. And I ended up in a beautiful sort of place in St. John's Wood with a lovely couple called Kate and John. And I remember this was a really formative part of my education, to be in London for that summer. And the world I wanted wasn't going to be the world of my parents, the world of my family. And so that sort of catapulted me there. I never really thought about teaching. It wasn't something I planned to be. I admired good teachers, but like most people, you'd think, well, who wants to go and work with young people and teenagers and adolescents? You know,
What was your aim back then?
I think it was academic. I think I loved learning. I liked an idea of a career in the Foreign Office. I liked the idea of the BBC. But I mean, these are real blue chip sort of institutions in the UK, and it's very competitive. And I didn't have the confidence at that point. I felt my accent sort of held me back, the way perhaps my outlook, my mindset. But like most of these things, you stumble into it. And I stumbled into teaching. I stumbled into, when I left university, I'd actually managed a bar. I'd done lots of jobs, because I couldn't afford summers around Europe. So I'd been working on building sites. I'd been working in factories, all good formative experience. I worked in Marks and Spencer, the British retail giant. But I ended up managing a bar in York as a student and worked in a theatre. And all these skills you realize again on reflection, what they do to shape you. And actually I appreciate, it's funny being a director in an organization in Moldova, that everybody's role is so crucial, from the janitor, the caretaker, to the cleaners, to the teachers, and all of this makes this sort of organization work. So all of that was all beneficial, but I stumbled into teaching at a brilliant school called Bootham, which had a very interesting philosophy. It's a Quaker school, which is a sort of, Quakers I suppose have been often described flippantly as Western Buddhists. They see God everywhere, the silences, the reflections are very powerful. And this really was instrumental in seeing how education could be so developmental, so formative. And some of my heroes in education, people like Kurt Hahn of the IB, were sort of already giving me ideas of actually, if you look at my own story, it isn't just about passing a test. It isn't just about paying a lot of money for the prestige and brand of a school. It's actually much more than that. And I was very fortunate in my career, when my teaching career took off, to then become a sort of global educator. So when you see schools in the middle of nowhere in Indonesia, in jungles, or in Tomsk, or in the north of Canada, in the sort of the wildernesses in the forest, or you go to a very sophisticated city like London or Geneva and you see education there, you get to see these common things that run through the development of the mind, development of a child, giving students and young people ambitions, focus, aims, and all of this is very powerful. And I think for me, education and teaching was always a privilege, and still feel very proud of the job I do. We need great teachers in our societies. Unfortunately, as we've seen, I mean, you asked about Moldova, and I'm sorry, I'm going to land this tangent in a moment. But actually, one of the things that always impressed me about Moldova, and in some respects the former Soviet Union, was the sort of attitude and the belief and the values attached to education, to teachers, to the educational process. And I think that still is the case. So when I first started working with Moldova, it was my good friend and colleague Tatiana Popper, and I saw the work that they were doing in Chisinau, in a Saki school, and e-twinning projects, and actually the power of opening the world up to Moldovans, and this incredible ability they had for languages. And okay, migration is an issue in this country, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, but at the same time, there was a really positive outward-facing mentality about Moldovans and the world. And I loved the energy they had to go and find their work and their destinies, and that tie to home as diaspora, I can speak that from my Welsh side, was still very powerful as well. And so in some respects, that sort of led me to Moldova. But like with many things, you kind of get older, you get married, you have a family, you start to kind of think about more solid things that you need in life. And so when the challenge came up to come here and sort of help establish the first international school here and actually give it purpose and a sort of thread that actually had a wider reach in Moldova, I just thought this is going to be the challenge of a career. So in many respects, all of that story, leads us to the place we are at the present, and I think that's what got me here.
What did you study in university?
I studied what I loved, and I wasn't career orientated like accountancy or law. It was history and politics. I absolutely soaked up history and politics. I come from a very historical area. There's like a 15-minute drive where I can show you 4,000 years of history. There's 9H Hill Fort on the Wrekin. There's the Roman city of Wroxeter. There's the first iron bridge in the world, Buildwas medieval abbey. The birthplace of industry, Abraham Darby I, he smelted coke and iron together in 1709. I come from a very historical area. It exudes. I love that reach to the past. I like feeling insignificant. I like feeling that that we are the speck of dust and that people have come before us and people will come after us. And it probably grounds us to know our place in things.
Just ants on
Absolutely.
floating in the cosmos.
And when you sort of study historical figures, or you stand in a graveyard, you can look at someone's biography from the past, you can look at someone's great work, and you think about the humanity that they were, they think about the time they lived in. And so history always fascinated me, and it still does. And especially, there's no end to history. It can be very Eurocentric, it can be very British-centric, but world history, you're never going to exhaust your study of history as a sort of field. And politics fascinates me, I guess, because I came from a very political household, very left-wing household in the sense of a sort of Western European social democracy. And evolution rather than revolution, but certainly believing in things like equality and justice and social justice. And we saw that in a very sort of class society, which is ironic that I've ended up working in both private school systems and state school systems. And I don't see that as a dilemma, because it's a fact of life. It exists. People pay for things. People pay taxes for things. But actually, the point I've always seen is that get the best out of all of it. There was a very famous Welsh socialist who set up the National Health Service in the UK, and Aaron Bevan, and we actually was near his statue in Cardiff the other week with my children, and he said it's not to take champagne away from the rich, it's to allow everybody to drink champagne. And I kind of like this theory of socialism rather than the austere, let's rebuild society and turn it into some sort of awful totalitarian nightmare. But
like the Bolsheviks.
Possibly. But actually, that is also another fascination of this part of the world. That probably what started out, the injustices of Tsarism or, autocratic rule. And probably, I think it was William Wordsworth, the poet, who said after the French Revolution, right at the start in May 1789, heaven to be alive that dawn, bliss to be so young. And I think people probably felt that in 1917 and probably thought they were building a new society, but as we know, revolutions devour their children, and we saw that in the most horrific way. I can't, in this city, and I think history is so tangible in this city of Chisinau, we've just driven past the Armenian cemetery. I think the memorial down by the railway station to those that were sent to Siberia in another purge of trying to make a perfect society, the Holocaust memorial in this city, all of those things really remind us of the fragility of our humanity, and actually that we're living with our past, we're living with all those strands that have come through us and will continue to carry on past us into the next generation. So, but I think the politics was a good foil to history. I think the two subjects go together really well. But I've always been fascinated. I never wanted to go into politics. But I love the study of political science, and I love the study of leaders, of ideas, of politics as an art, the power of doing good. And although people are very cynical about politicians, and we've seen a very dramatic change in sort of leaders and politics with the age of Trump, the age of Brexit, Putin, absolutely. But are there still good people? I mean, the notion of public good, the notion of duty, and what I find really refreshing in Moldova at the moment, and I hope it's not just a passing phase, is there seems to be a sort of move back to this idea of virtue and serving the people. And we see that in how the corruption is now being sort of viewed, and whether that will have a longer lasting effect or whether the same sort of people come back in a different form, different sort of names, waits to be seen. But I think the optimistic view of society and people is always one I would sort of err to, and not the cynicism and the sort of the pessimism of humanity. So politics and history always gave me this sort of ability, and the more you go deeper into it, the more it just opens it up to another world. So
2 questions. Sure. The first one, if you'd have the chance to hop into a time machine and visit a time and place, which would that be? And the second question is like tied to that. If there was a chance to meet a politician from all ages, which one would you choose to meet? Like, for example, like you're talking to me.
Okay, that's 2 very good questions. I think anyone who's studied the life and the works of Abraham Lincoln would want to go and talk to Lincoln. But Lincoln I think when he died, one of his cabinet members said he belongs to the ages now. Knowing the sort of the work that he'd done, the wisdom that this guy brought, I think that would have been fascinating to have managed to sort of not only hold America together at that point, but to abolish slavery in the middle of it. I mean, it's phenomenal. And knowing his humble background, there's obviously Welsh in his blood, his family when they were sort of living in a wooden hut on the sort of in the Midwest. But that would have been a politician I would definitely have liked to have gone back and spoken, and just to be in the presence of. I think in terms of time machine, where to go in a time machine, there's a selfish sort of streak that I would love to just go and actually follow my own family line back. I did some research. We're very lucky in the UK to have records that go back, census records go back to 1841. You've got church and birth and death records in church back to the 1600s. So you can even ordinary folk can find their, there's a TV program called Who Do You Think You Are? And they take a famous person and they go and find. It's very British and American. No doubt it will reach here, but it is actually interesting looking. And recently there was a comedian and he's related to kings and queens of England, and it was wonderful. Most people, I think, if they say they had a previous life, they were Tsar Nicholas II or somebody, or Henry VIII. But most of us were pretty ordinary. History's made up of very ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So there's a temptation to go and follow a timeline of my family on the Welsh borders and just see their sort of what they were about. I mean,
your ancestors.
Absolutely. But in terms of going back to a time that's already gone, I think ancient Rome at its height maybe would have been good.
But its height during what emperor?
Oh, let's have a look. I'd go for, I think, Marcus Aurelius. I think we'd go for sort of 2nd century AD. I think that would have been sort of an interesting time to have seen it.
During his conquest?
I think, yeah. Well, there you go. There's a figure I would also like to speak to, Marcus Aurelius, and sort of the concept of Stoicism, and yeah, I think that would have been an interesting. I think we're getting back to technology. When we look at films, I mean, it's quite old now, I suppose, Gladiator, but when you see those films now, and they're actually showing you cities like Rome, and it's the sort of the technology allows it to be real, and suddenly you're transported into those places. And again, that's that link in history that puts yourself out of your context and your sort of idea that you are unique and you're sort of at the top of your tree, but actually you're not. It goes back to the speck of dust idea. So maybe those.
I think in the very near future we'll have VR tours through various.
I think so. Well, even like in my own subject about teaching history. So one of the reasons that again got me into the international work is teaching sort of disaffected 14-year-old boys in Bristol who weren't continuing the subject after 14 for exams. So on wet Wednesday afternoons, when you're trying to struggle with all these egos and hormones, and suddenly they come up with a really fantastic question, which is why it's brilliant working with young people, and said, do they study the Holocaust in Germany? It was I guess they do, and I knew they did because I got German friends to it. But I wanted them to think about it, and I said, how would they approach the Holocaust in Germany? And then as it developed an idea with his class, and I had some contacts with the British Council. This is about when I first started teaching in sort of mid-90s. I also discovered there was a very expensive piece of equipment with technology. We talked about phones earlier and what the capabilities are, but this huge Polycom video conference camera, which I think cost about £10,000, but was stuck in a cupboard not being used. And eventually we got a very simple thing together, which was a school in Russia, in Tomsk, a school in Germany near Bonn, and ourselves in Bristol. And actually this incredible, it's the most powerful moment in education that I've had, and everything else has always been measured by that. And I've done probably bigger things since then, but to get these kids to speak to this school in Germany, and at that time it was the sort of breakup of Yugoslavia, the Bosnian War. This was 96, I think. Mm-hmm. And then these kids in Russia, in Tomsk, and they were saying, but the Britain wasn't in the Great War, the Great Patriotic War. And it's like, well, we don't even call it, it's World War II. And the Germans saying, well, actually our Holocaust history is really developed and we have to really... And suddenly these ordinary kids from the edge of Bristol were being exposed to this kind of huge world. And actually, there were kids in private schools who were paying a fortune for their education, were not getting the same of education as this. And it was so groundbreaking. And what's really interesting now at Heritage, and not just at Heritage, but the world is coming into these classrooms every day. Classrooms and cultures are connected every day through technology. If they want to talk to a school in France, that can be arranged in like half an hour, and it's sort of a class is talking to a class. And that has actually transformed education. And I think it still is not really understood by many educators and people.
And not used.
No, and definitely
You have an
underused.
amazing tool that you just don't use.
People still think it's boring textbooks, and in this pandemic, there's been a lot of. I've sat in many conferences where everybody wants to say education's reimagined, paradigm shifts. They're more subtle than that, because I think we're still living with the very reality that the pandemic has got a lot longer to play out. But we've kind of adjusted to how the pandemic's going to be, and our vaccinations, our masks, and all those things. But at the same time, the learning has shifted, and to actually move the sort of learning in classrooms to this technological basis, and when we talk about things like independent learning or developing critical thinking, but the opportunities there to actually connect with a wider world and this globalized world. And that's something that I was doing sort of 95, 96, and that then developed into a career in international education of effectively going, I mean, I was very fortunate to go to some really interesting places and still do, and actually connect classrooms. And actually, when we talk about the sort of barriers to our identities, or who we think we are, or the prejudices we may hold, that's what education banishes. That's how we find out that kids, in Altai were loving David Beckham and wearing Manchester United shirts, or in the jungles of Indonesia. I went to this extraordinary school, just literally huts, and they were doing this graffiti project, and this boy said, "You're from Bristol, aren't you?" And it's a decay, because Bristol's well known, but I wasn't expecting it to be. And he said, "Banksy. We love Banksy." So this project, so there I was in East Kalimantan in this kind of rainforest, and they were doing a Banksy project. This was 20 years ago, and it was that's when you realise things are so much more powerful than you.
It's cultural revolution.
Absolutely. And some of our policymakers, lots of our policymakers, because of the way they've been educated and the way that they're passed and don't get this, they don't understand this. So I mean, we said before we started filming about not banning phones. How can you ban technology in your schools? It's counterintuitive to what you are supposed to be teaching them for the future and with the skills they are going to need, that they need now. And so what we do, of course, is teach digital literacy. We teach balance. We teach well-being around it. We know that too much technology, too much screen time is not very good for them. And so, but that the adults don't model that either. How many times do we go to a cafe or watch children and families in parks, and all the adults are doing this, swiping. That's not the balance either. So that's going to be one of our big challenges in our age, but we can't just, quote, ban them. What we can do is develop rules, we can develop cultures and habits and norms, and that's governed everything that we've done every time technology has transformed and flipped our society onto another plane. And we just adjust, because that's what humanity does. It adapts and it adjusts.
Well, at the end of the day, it has always helped. For example, the same was with the radio and the TV. And
live music would never exist because the gramophone, that kind of nonsense.
Yeah, or for example, many are saying that, the internet is evil, it just plays with the hearts and minds of people, and they manipulate these people and stuff. But they don't remember that in the Third Reich, Goebbels was giving away radios just to have a better connection with the people and to brainwash them better.
Well, I think last time we spoke, when we looked at what happened in Eastern Europe after World War II, I mean, yes, the Red Army had a physical presence. It was the most powerful military in the world. It just conquered Nazi Germany. But it wasn't that conquered and turned these satellite states into the Warsaw Pact. They allowed, as we know in Romania, King Michael was there till 47, so 2 years or so. But they took over the propaganda ministries, the information ministries, the interior ministries, and those key things with their technology and with that coercion to be able to kind of manipulate and to sort of make sure that they brought the population on with them and channeled the information. And then the elites were easy to pick off. I mean, we saw that in every example of where any counter threat to the prevailing thoughts. And bizarrely, we see that in societies happening in the UK. We see that against Brexit. We see that with Trump's America. And so the horrible, is it Trotsky about, or Marx rather, history repeating itself first as farce, and then, as tragedy, and then as farce. I think we're living through that time now, unfortunately.
And, well, in my opinion, for example, I loved history at school. but I hated the like.
Well, you know,
No.
Churchill himself said, I hate to be taught, but I love to learn. So.
Yeah, because, well, all the dates were just, you have to know that date, you have to know this date. But if you teach history through its cyclicity, if you explain to the kid that what's happening now has happened many times in the past, because we are very, very transient. And when you're making these parallels, when you're bringing Churchill, when you're bringing, even like, let's say, Marcus Aurelius closer to him, showing him that book about Stoicism that he wrote, quoting some stuff that he can use today, that is proper teaching, and not just like knowing when Marcus Aurelius was born or died.
Absolutely. And I think there's still an obsession with this kind of factual concept, especially with history of sort of dates and kings and queens, and it has a small place. But as you say, absolutely, in terms of the broader strokes, the themes of history, one of the big issues that the UK and the USA have suffered from is the idea of teaching Black history, and for us in the UK, the empire. And and it was ignored. I mean, Bristol was a slave city. It was a city of empire, same as Liverpool. There was actually the Commonwealth and Empire Museum for a short time in Bristol, and Colston's statue being yanked off its pedestal and thrown into the docks was a big iconic moment in 2020. And actually the schools that were named after him have now renamed or about to. The Colston Hall where the Beatles played and all these famous people, that's been renamed. But in the UK, we had a very difficult time teaching what was central in our history, and even though it seems such a long time since it happened. And I'll give an example of my own family history. So my grandfather fought in World War I. He was 16. He had poverty at home, so he lied about his age in 1914 and joined up and went to fight in Flanders. And he survived World War I, which was very unusual for somebody to survive for 4 years. And rather than go back home, and he was still a young man, he went to India in 1919. He stayed there till 1934. And a young man in his 20s in India would, you're not going to sit around in knitting circles and drinking tea and sending postcards home. And like many British soldiers there, they married, however that was seen legally, an Indian wife and had Indian children. And recently, I've been working with some colleagues there, and we found this family kind of exists. So, and then what was interesting when I presented that fact to my own family, and my family are pretty chilled, and so I thought they were, and it was quite a shock. And not because, and I hate to say this, but I know that would it have been different if I'd have found a family or a nice white family in America? I'm sure it would have. But for me, I was fascinated. It doesn't, to have this kind of Indian branch of the family that exists. And my dream is to actually go and find those places and maybe even connect with some distant cousins or from all of this period. But it just underlies again this sort of idea that people aren't comfortable sometimes with their past. And then when we get to a society like Moldova, and you're trying to teach, or you're trying to have a neutral kind of platform to look at the Holocaust, or look at the purges, or look at sort of Stalin's sort of Russia, that's very difficult for a lot of people in this society also as well to face things, because there's a very direct link for a lot of people to what happened, in recent history. But at the same time, I think I'm going to quote Cicero now, but to remain ignorant of the past is to forever remain a child. And it's like, this is what we've got to do. We've got to be able to confront. And there was a very interesting example in Spain with Franco's Spain. And when Franco died in 1975, they actually called it the Pact of Forgetting. And they just forgot it. They didn't want to talk about it. But unfortunately for them, fortunately for the new generation, they wanted to talk about it. They wanted to talk about why villages fought villages and brothers fought brothers. And the one thing we know in history is we can't forget at some point somebody wants to go and have a look at where they're from. They want their identity. They want to know where their roots are from. So you asked at the beginning your story. Everybody wants to put their story together. They don't want to just exist in a kind of existentialist sort of vacuum. They want to know where they're from, who they belong to, what they look like, where they're going as well. So
you were saying that you had this relevant discussion with the German kids about the Holocaust. How do they handle it?
Much better than, I mean, there is a Holocaust Education Trust in the UK which does a remarkable work in some really brilliant schools. I think that the overwhelming guilt, I've got very close German friends in Dresden, and his father was a brilliant history teacher.
The city which was like...
Absolutely, and the British don't have a great record there either, so what they did to the Florence of the Elbe, when the war was virtually over, February 45. But I think the Germans, I mean, right next to Berlin is this huge Holocaust memorial, which you can't miss because it's huge blocks of sort of like tombstones. It's right next to, by the Brandenburg Gate, the Berlin Wall, where the old Berlin Wall was, and the Reichstag. It's there. It's right in the heart of what would have been more or less where the Reichschancellery was. In their history, the way they teach it, the Germans went through an extraordinary cathartic. I mean, nothing had existed in history before as an event. The horror, trying to explain it, and I think we're still trying to explain it in many respects. Each generation that looks at it, and I've taken many school visits to Auschwitz, to Buchenwald, to Dachau, to Sachsenhausen, and it still can't explain how human beings treat each other. And then instead of thinking that's a period of history that's long gone, and then we fast forward in European history, we're looking at Srebrenica, we're looking at...
Well, it's not that long.
Absolutely not. And trying to explain and put it into an educational context, to try and get lessons from that, try to get, humanity to get back together again and to move themselves forward. But teaching that is difficult. I think West Germany in particular had a very strong record, but then people will argue that a lot of it was swept under the carpet. There wasn't real denazification trials until the 60s. Eichmann's trial was a big moment in going back, because obviously he had the Nuremberg trials in 46 with the big figures like Speer and Goering, but it wasn't until that moment then. And even now, there are still a couple of old survivors in their 90s left, and it's still saying, well, once those people are gone, maybe it could be different. But then in East Germany, you move straight into a different totalitarian system, but more or less the same, just different sort of people to hate and different sort of uniforms. The Stasi, and we see that still continue now. And I love the idea that Putin was a KGB colonel hiding in Dresden at that point, as they were sort of protesting and coming out onto the streets.
Very near to us. It's like it's your history. It's the history of my parents.
Well, I've said to you before that, again, one of my formative moments, again, great teachers, as we were on a school trip, we'd planned it and the wall had come down, but it was a few weeks after the wall had come down in 1989, November the 9th. And we were there, and to stand on the Berlin Wall at that moment of history, and it's left such an indelible impression in me so going back in the time machines, I probably would like to go back to that moment again. We still, or my generation, I'm older than you, I know, my generation still thinks of that as more recent. But actually, it is a piece of history. It's one of the defining moments of the 20th century. And I think it's a bit like, Chow En-lai was asked about what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said it was too soon to tell. And it's almost these revolutions of 89, 91. I think it's still too soon to tell about these consequences as well. But again, you want a troubled mind, don't study history. But it is the way that I think the Germans are almost overwhelmed with that amount of history. They must have to try and condense and to make sense of what Germany stands for. And I thought it was really interesting with Merkel passing on to a new chancellor after 16 years. And we saw what Trump did on January the 6th a year ago as a way of not passing on power in a peaceful transfer of democracy. Merkel's was very different, just simply waved, walked out the door, passed on. Absolutely. So I think
the most punk that you should have.
True class. So, but there we go.
Yeah. So let's get back on track about our discussion about you and Moldova. So, what was the first impression about Moldova, and how did it change throughout the time?
Well, as my good friend Tatiana Popper will tell you, when we first used to work together with our schools, and I was in Wales with a school, and it was her students, and they were brilliant. First of all, my students were expecting, they'd done their research, and they had it already. Poorest country in Europe, corrupt, little tiny states, all those kind of cliches. And the students from Asaki said, We don't want to talk about being the poorest country in Europe. We're much more than that. We don't want to talk about the wine. We don't want to talk about corruption. We want to talk to you about music. We want to talk to you about sport. We want to talk about ambitions, dreams, education, books. And that transformed. I love that moment. I think that hooked me on Moldova, listening to this kind of resistance, this sort of voice of young people. And I know that the young people of this country are its future. And it's a cliche and it's a truism, but at the same time, when you heard this kind of passion, and I thought, I don't hear that in British kids. I don't hear that in the way there's the materialism and the good life of a fifth or sixth largest economy in the world, and lots of good infrastructure and investment and taxes being paid and all the rest of it, and high wages. And there we have this other country, which actually has got a really fascinating history. It's complex. It's Europe. It's not, or it doesn't seem to be sometimes. It's got this really difficult sort of issue with language and sort of Romanian, Russian, and all those things. And I think that was the hook for me, that this was a fascinating part of the world to work with. And because lots of projects, I was did a lot of work with the British Council, great organisation, connecting culture and classroom for 80, 90 years. This was so unusual. There was no real connection to this part of Europe. And the part of the kind of the Brexit sort of preamble was the racism and the sort of the hatred about Romanians and Bulgarians all coming to the UK to take jobs because of the single market. And that really did have a huge impact on the mindset of Brexit, building up to Brexit. But I was fascinated with it. And I think, again, education, Moldova valued education, they valued educators, they valued teachers. There was still a real love of learning and culture. And what I liked about young people, and this sounds slightly, as I'm being patronising, but I don't mean it this way, there was an innocence about the world in a good way. They may not to say they weren't aware of the world. I mean, like any teenagers and young people, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But at the same time, there was a sort of an engagement in the world, and there was still some values that they didn't just discard because their parents held them. And I think when we started to work with these students and their interest, their engagement, so I didn't think I would come to Moldova in the circumstances that I did. We were working with the schools, we were working with partners and colleagues here. So it wasn't a game plan to get here other than perhaps bring some students here, start to develop links more with the UK and Moldova. But then, life isn't a straight line. So the opportunity, when it came. So,
what about heritage? How did that turn out for you?
That's heritage is a fascinating project for this country, for education. I still don't think people understand what a game changer it is and why it's needed in the society. Many people will see it as a place of privilege or a place of wealth or a place of, it's unobtainable. It's not connected to the real Moldova but heritage, for me, is a fascinating project in education, because it was never going to come from the ministry to show Moldova what it needed for the 21st century, because we know the legacy of the past is still very strong. We know that to shift people, even though Moldova had shifted and had a revolution and change in 91, the same people were kind of there, the same mentality, the same mindsets. And we knew that the country's losing young people and using talent and skills because they don't see it shifting, because the elites are still very entrenched, or they were. And the project, Natalia Chetitova and Sinan Bora, for them, they wanted to have, it's almost like showing Moldova what every school should be like, every education should look like this, every curriculum, every world qualifications that can transfer and give you social mobility and actually want you to stay. I mean, if you look at societies like Norway or Ireland, young people, of course, they leave their villages and they leave who wants to be in a tiny mountain?
What you're saying is that, from what I gather, is that heritage is like a proof of concept.
I think that's a very good way of putting it. I think if you look, if it was on its own in a bubble, and it was isolated at the end of Dacia Boulevard and had no engagement, and then it's not adding anything to Moldova. And I think where I came in after a couple of years that it had been established. And I've been working with them now since 2018. I was appointed in early 2019. And I saw personally where that project could go as a school, and what we could actually do and what we've actually done. And the pandemic, ironically, was the sort of the game changer, because Minister Popovich came in on the Saturday afternoon, early March of 2020, and we'd already been running this online sort of synchronous lessons for a week or so, and they just wanted to see a solution. And I have to applaud that ability, because that was a big moment for them to come to us and actually say, oh my goodness, I mean, the barriers to heritage kind of existing and the sort of the negativity, but they came in, and actually it was one of the best conversations I think in education, in my opinion, this country had. And of course, what I did is I made the tea. I allowed my people to just basically show them, give them what they need, because there was already talk about putting the schools out for months and then not paying teachers, and that's not fair to our colleagues in the state system, and we didn't know where the crisis was even going to go at that point. And I think that was the game changer, and it's continued ever since. And it's interesting with the Cambridge qualifications and sort of talking about the value. The other movement on this, and it's happened like many of these things do under the radar, and you only see them when they start to really appear. But we've been doing founders lectures from the beginning. So we've had probably 25, 30 now. Really big names, like not just big names in Moldova, ambassadors and whoever, but people from the world of business, Oxford colleges, young Moldovans who live abroad. And what we've been able to do now, because of the technology, we've been able to bring those lectures to invite the colleagues in our networks, because that's what's good about Moldovan education. They network so well, and it's a small enough society for everybody to know each other. So those students are coming into these lectures every time we do them, once a month. And that's having an impact. And I feel that we're doing more value in this approach and this collaboration. But that's what the education system in this country should be about. So when we talk about a national education community, it's a top-down. It's normally people who've never been in a classroom before, that have never been out of a ministry. There's no real leadership in the schools. There's no, I mean, the infrastructure, the real crime of the corruption of this country is the money that was taken from children. So those people in London right now enjoying a sort of, a kleptocracy lifestyle and trying to pretend they didn't take money out of this country, their damage has been to children, because those billions should have been invested in infrastructure, in schools that look like palaces, that people will, every school should look like heritage in this country, and not the crumbling edifices that we've been left from the Soviet Union. And we should be investing in those teachers. We're just about on the tipping point where most of the good teachers in this country still are remaining, and we need to invest in them more and not overload them with bureaucracy and nonsense. And I think it's quite a seismic shift to actually move that forward. But what's interesting, as you just alluded to then, having this model actually gives an alternative. And maybe that's probably what they don't like. But at the same time, the status quo isn't going to work. So when I hear things like Soviet attitudes in education or Moldovan mindsets, which I heard a lot of sometimes, this is where a really, really transformative moment for this country would be. And interestingly, Blair said it in England when he came in the UK, education, education, education. And I think that would be a huge investment, and that would be the stability, and that would be the real building block for Moldova in the future, because all that talent and skill that's gone abroad, and people now, we see that the diaspora coming back because of the pandemic and because of family ties, but actually there's a dissatisfaction because they know what they've experienced in societies in Austria, in the United States, in Britain, in Ireland, and they don't want to put up with the same nonsense now when they come back. They want to have those systems which aren't heavily bureaucratic and full of red tape and blue stamps for the sake of it. And I think education is somewhere where that really could have the transformative effect and actually give some hope. But we're a small player in this as a school. I mean, our view is not Moldova, as it were, so much. We're in a wide network of global schools. We see our reputation, we see our vision as the school down the road can't tell me what I need to do for the students, of my school. And incidentally, and I will say this, the private system in Moldova is just a replication of the national system, but you're paying more money for it. And so this idea that somehow that's a better quality education, often it's people market themselves on gimmicks like pizzas or Italian chefs. How is that developing young people for the future? How is that actually a curriculum and a set of skills and knowledge that are preparing people for a future that actually could be the future leaders of this country, not just in politics, of course, but business, media, sport, all those sorts of things. And that's what we're missing out on at the moment. And I think the vision that would actually tie the young people in diaspora back to the country would actually be along those lines. But that's a huge, huge, huge challenge, even for a government and a sort of, the current government with the vision they have. The difference between vision, implementation, and reality is still huge right now. But at least we feel there's a better start at the moment in this country. And that, I wasn't destined to stay here beyond the 2 years that I originally looked at, but it's a fascinating challenge, and it's a fascinating society. And I'm very proud to sort of fly that flag for Moldova in the arenas that I work in global education. And I defend Moldova, and I feel it's my adopted country. When I come back through the security at Chisinau and the passport control, I feel I'm coming home in the same. It's a really strange feeling. Home isn't a place, it's a feeling. It feels like when I come home here.
This is really nice. One of the biggest achievements, from my point of view, of heritage, as far as I know, that you actually have a certification for A levels. So for those that are watching us, A levels is basically the Lyceum of Great Britain. Basically, where if you have A levels, you can just apply for much easier for British tuition. And knowing the system, it was pretty hard doing that, like implementing that. How hard was it actually?
Well, I'd say I'm in awe of our two founders, because this vision to actually create an educational establishment that was from 6 to 19, but which was literally from starting at kindergarten and preparing you to get into universities around the world. And this wasn't a smooth transition. The barriers that were up, trying to convince the value in. I remember sitting in the ministry with representatives of the International Baccalaureate, and one of the guys still saying, but we have to have the Baccalaureate of Moldova, and we have to have, so it will have to have 30 hours and 30 hours. And so how would a child study 60 hours, 17 years of age? What would it bring to them? And I think there's a strange mindset still there. How is that developing the skills that they need? So with the A levels, I think probably one of the proudest achievements, and I really hope that post-16 education does follow the lead. There are some really good visionary people in this country in education. The Chancellor of the Technical University, Varel Bostan, who spoke at one of our founders' lectures, listen to him speak about young people and social mobility and education and roots and career progression. And I think this is where the A levels tie into that, and those kind of voices I hope get louder in this society and have more importance, and there are many others as well. But for us to, again, it's modeling this system, this group of qualifications that have the ability to take students into other arenas. And again, most of our students in our current first cohort, they will have a year abroad in university. They see it in a kind of, we'll come back to Moldova for this amount of time, we'll go abroad, we'll do some study there. And I think that's healthy, that's European. You look at the Erasmus program, that's exactly what it does for most young European students. But it is quite an achievement to actually have this model of education that, again, I think, go back to drinking champagne for everybody. I think all schools should have this. It shouldn't be just one school, and just because you can afford to pay some money. And I think that's where I would like to see this model develop more. And we are working with other schools. I think the concept of an education that develops holistically a person, not just because of the qualifications, not just because you load them with hours of study each week, but actually get them to challenge themselves, get them to work in a team, get them to do some voluntary work. I think
the soft skills.
Absolutely. And things like the social responsibility. If we want to make them civic minded and see public duty as a sort of good thing, then get them involved in those schemes. We do a lot of work with the dog shelters in this country. I'm still aghast at how some of the comments are made about sort of animal welfare in this society. Get them involved in them. Go and help those children's homes that need more investment, more support.
And probably maybe just attention.
Absolutely. And what I was having a thought the other day about what Moldova needs. The skills are here. The skills are in the people here. And actually, I will never lose my contact with Moldova. I don't know what the future holds, but I know in my heart, me and Moldova are sort of for life. And I thought that one day I'll come back and it won't be all the NGOs. That won't be its internationalism or its kind of global status. It won't be a republic of NGOs. But internationally, it will have tourism. It will have business investment. It will have students come in to study here in huge numbers, not just because they can get into a medical university easily, but it will have a much more developed sense of where it is with the world. And I think I don't really sort of look into Moldovan politics too closely, but it was a big moment for sort of a president of this country to be named as a leading European politician recently. The respect that that's brought to the country in the name of Moldova, and not just wine, poorest country in Europe, corruption. Actually, it's known for a lot more than just that now, and people are actually very interested to see in the post-Soviet development and context what a country can do when it's got the right direction, the right leadership, the right dedication, the right spirit, the right investment, and where it could actually go as a country. So I think the A-levels, it sounds really blown up as an ambition, but actually that's a really important moment for a country that can actually say, because what has astonished the people that we work with, the partners like Cambridge or the British Council, or within Europe, e-twinning, is that we are the first. And I still find that quite odd that this isn't a bigger movement, but again, education is very close-knit, and these collaborators, they work together really well. And the charlatans that kind of came in and sort of, tried to make some money out of perhaps, bizarre courses or claiming that they were the organization for whoever, I don't know, English or something, those people have kind of gone to the margins now, and the real authenticity and the real kind of people who actually want to, work with each other and share skills and actually bring each other on. We lift each other up. That's what's coming to the fore, I think. And I think the crisis had a huge role in that, in this kind of real national education community. But the one deficiency I still feel that we have is leadership. I still feel that, I coming into an education system where it's still authoritarian, where the role of the director, the dominal, is still kind of looked up to in awe. And coming from education systems in the US and the UK, where, I know what my role and my title are, but I'm nothing without those teachers or those leaders that we're skilling up to kind of make decisions and to sort of, be able to sort of operate with autonomy. And I think we see that in business, but I think the public services need to get much more of that in their thinking.
Vertical.
Very, very much so. And I think there's still a fear of ownership. And I wrote an article not so long ago for a UK international magazine talking about educational leadership in Eastern Europe. And Sir Hai Plohi's book and film, the HBO series did it on Chernobyl. If you look at the sort of the steps that they did so brilliantly, and it was a brilliant drama, of the moment that the tests were being run, and they all knew it was going to end up in this nuclear meltdown of the power plant, and they still ran it. And what was really fascinating is that everybody was justified in their little part, that they did their bit of responsibility, but they were not then passing it up the chain. And I think when we look at organizations, it's that sort of fear, but not having the tie-up and the responsibility that we see. And I can understand when people talk about mindsets and sort of Soviet mindsets, that we've got to have this kind of better culture of more proactive and more sort of autonomy. And it's certainly happening in business. It's certainly lots of businesses in this country with close ties internationally do that. Kaufland, Summer, they're those kind of companies. But I think the public services need a real revolution of this kind of mentality. And I think there was a speech given not so long ago by Maya Sandu that, getting those people that can be in those middle ranks is really crucial, and not seeing them go abroad and not seeing them take those skills away as well. So.
We usually try and discuss more topics
Sure.
in this show. And one of the topics that I'm interested in, because it has a big impact on our life, is religion. And what's your take on religion? And do you believe in God?
I'm going to do the agnostic. It's kind of like insurance policy. I'd like to think there was something, but we can't prove and we can't disprove. I wasn't brought up in a particular religious household. I've seen so many awful things because of organized religion. We've seen the way that social stigma has been placed on children out of wedlock or marriage as an institution. We've seen the church go to parts of Africa, South America, Asia, and use the cross as part of colonization. And we've seen all this awful sides of things. But again, as a student of the world, I've also seen people whose faith has been so powerful and so strong that it's motivated them to do some incredible acts of human kindness, of human goodness, to lead communities, to build churches. I think being sort of in the middle and not having a strong view and not being embedded with a strong faith allows you perhaps to not get sort of dragged into one corner. Absolutely. I think the life of the current Pope, I'm not a Catholic, but Pope Francis's life and the dilemma of his life when he was trying to save people under the Argentinian junta in the 70s, and at the same time, thousands of young people being drugged and thrown out of aeroplanes in the Andes and killed because of their opposition to the regime. I mentioned earlier that I was heavily influenced by working in a Quaker school, which probably isn't so well known in this part of Eastern Europe, but Quaker philosophy emerged in the 1600s from that sort of non-conformist movement in the Protestant religion, certainly in places like England. Philadelphia was a very famous Quaker city. There were lots of Quakers who signed the Declaration of Independence. It had a very strong political force because it was so much about independence away from traditional authority of the state, of the king. Quakers didn't recognize the sort of the paraphernalia of the church and the opulence that you saw, especially with sort of Catholic churches, even in Protestant churches.
Problem that we have now.
Absolutely. But interestingly, from an aesthetic point of view, the amount of, people, I have a mother-in-law who was a wonderful art teacher. They love iconography. They love the gold. They love the sort of but that's not the same as believing in these places. We look at the relationships between men and women, and we look at how churches have influenced that in a negative way. And I think Moldova signing recently the Istanbul Convention and the campaigns against the violence in the home, against women, against girls, is extraordinary marker for Moldova. I felt very proud of that moment. But at the same time, it was awful to read of some religious figures seeing that as an attack on the family, that somehow, the ability to not beat your spouse was, taking away, quote, a human right. And I think there's so much contradiction in that. But I think, again, as a sort of an observer, to look for sort of meaning in life is a good thing. I think that chimes in with philosophy. I think that's we have religious education in the UK, and it's a good thing in terms of teaching about the major world faiths, the major world religions, especially where people have issues perhaps with Islam because of what's happened in recent history, and trying to sort of tie all that into a general theory that everybody's an extremist and everybody should be feared. Plenty of things been done in the name of Christianity, as we know, extremists and the way that violence has been perpetual throughout that. But with the Quaker religion, the Quaker faith, I like the silences, I like the reflections. I like the idea that if God existed, it was everywhere. It wasn't just in a special place you went to. It wasn't a man with a white beard up in the sky sort of being all omnipotent. I think it was St. Thomas Aquinas who talked about, going through life and experiencing life before you even came to God. And I don't know if that's a process people go through myself. I'm going to say something personal here, which, not to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but my mother's dying at the moment. She has terminal cancer, and she's in her 70s. She worked and fought all her life, her children, her family, her neighbours, her community. She was a sort of led women in our area for the miners' strike. A decent person, would do anything for anybody. And interestingly, she's got a few weeks left, and my sister mentioned that it's the most at peace that she's ever been. And it's a really interesting comment and I actually admire my mother for that. We didn't always have a great relationship, and I'm the middle child and the acorn that fell furthest from the tree. But at the same time, I'm quite proud of this fact that there's a stoicism in the way she's approaching this. And she talked about she would meet her parents and she'd meet some of her siblings who passed away, and this kind of at peace with where things are in life. And I'm hoping I'll get a chance to see before she does die. We're planning to go back at Christmas and hopefully see her. But I would love to ask her about this. I thought it was a really interesting comment about where people are. And I know there's lots of work done with hospice patients and people at the end of their lives about what their views are and how they see the next stage. There's a lot of people, whether we're food for worms, whether there's nothing but dust. But I think it's a question that's, dominated humanity, the existence question, and why are we here, and the purpose question, and what
fear of death,
and what comes out. I had a very close experience with death a few years. I'll give you the short version of the story. So basically, one Sunday morning, about 13 years ago, I'd suffered from pneumonia so much all my life. I was a good rugby player, very strong and fit, but I'd always had this pneumonia, and it got worse and worse. And I'd been working in Siberia, and I'd been locked out in -25, -30 in the March of 2007. I'd gone and worked in Indonesia in the rainforests, and people thought it was a tropical disease.
Takes a toll.
Well, basically, I sat with a doctor one day in a hospital in Bristol, and he just basically said, "You're not going to get to 40. You will." And it was a very strange moment in life. And I remember going to a cafe and having a cup of tea and a bacon sandwich, and just thinking, shit. And then, as this health got worse, it was the January, and I proposed to my then girlfriend, who's my wife now, Jen, and thinking, I've got to put my affairs in order. I want to get things sorted. So there I was on this Sunday morning.
This scary combination of words.
Your affairs. Terrifying. Well, when people have these grown-up conversations, we all think we're infallible, don't we? I mean, when we're young, we all think we're forever young and beautiful and energetic and fit. And I think the young people and old people need to have more conversations. They need to know each other. There's a great scheme in this country where they've been working with old people, with technology, and young people. I think more of that. But on this Sunday morning in February, I sort of collapsed and I couldn't breathe. Something was in my throat, and I was ill, and all this kind of illness of pneumonia, and I couldn't breathe. And my wife, well, she was not my wife then, she kind of phoned the ambulance, and I was in the hallway, and I remember just thinking, this is it. And I could feel the panic went, and all I remember was the three thoughts. I thought, I want to speak to my mum and dad. I felt really awful because my study, I could see it out the corner of my eye, was all messy. And I thought, what's going to happen to Jen? Bills and money, and what will happen? And everything started to go tunnel, but it was a really strange, peaceful moment. And I stopped panicking. I just accepted, and it was a really weird kind of moment. It was gone. And what happened was I fell off the chair, and whatever's in my throat dislodged, and the ambulance came rushing in. They did the whole kind of thing, ready to do that. And what happened was this. 20 years before, when I was a student in school, I'd been sucking on the end of a Bic pen top, the spiky, and I'd been chewing it. And a teacher made us laugh, and I sort of laughed and I inhaled. And I was rushed to hospital, and they put cameras down and everything, and they couldn't see anything. And in the end, they said, look, it's gone into your stomach. If it was in your lungs, you would die. So for 20 years, this got worse and worse. I kept saying, I've got something in my right lung. I can feel it.
That thing
came flying out. I'll give you a picture of it to prove I'm not making this stuff. 20 years later, it came flying out of me. And here's the thing. I have a super immune system, it turns out. That thing could have pierced my lung any day in 20 years. I'd have drowned in my own blood, and I wouldn't have known what was the cause of my death in all of this. Obviously,
so you were unlucky but lucky.
I was, and in all that time, I think back now to that moment and think, well, I've got my 3 beautiful children. I got married. Jen's a remarkable person. I've been really fortunate to have this really good career. I have to occasionally get the pen top and look at it when I get mad or pissed or think this is not, and it's fine. But I think did I think of a greater being or existence of God or any of those things? My old mentor and teacher that I mentioned at the start, Les Jones, he just wrote to me and said, look, a man who has that in his lung for 20 years has a destiny. So if this is the destiny, I don't know. But I always find peace in those kind of places. In an old church, I remember a mosque in Indonesia, which was beautiful. And I'm not saying any words to anybody wise above me or around me, but there is a sense of peace. And I think when we stand in front of sort of buildings, or we look at the sort of the monuments that men and women have built, I kind of respect it, but at the same time, there is an ugly side to religion, and there's a controlling side. There's some very dark things being done to human beings in the name of religion, and still being done in the name of religion. That it's not something I'm allowing myself to even think about. I would love the idea that there was a wonderful paradise beyond this world, but then if paradise is supposed to be built on this earth now, then we should be building it and not waiting till we all die. So that's my views, I feel, at the moment.
So you have a wholesome family and a wholesome experience with that. But for example, our religious institution, they're applauding to that. But when the gays or lesbians or transes want to marry each other, it's a problem. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's quite a surprise to come to sort of a part of the world where, again, things like the European Human Rights Convention's been signed, where Istanbul Convention's finally been ratified, but we see mentalities haven't changed. To change laws is quite straightforward. Change social attitudes is different. From my personal point of view, my brother's gay. He's in a very strong relationship with a really nice guy called Barry. Love is love. And I think when we start to kind of put our own fears and prejudice on this, it's a very strange thing from my experience and the culture I've come from to see where this prejudice would come from and actually to even understand it. And I think there's a lot of education to be done, and not in the sense that people might feel that we're teaching children, all to sort of be this particular way, but actually just being dare I say it, modern about thinking about relationships and love and individuality and sexuality and gender. Why is that such a difficult conversation for us to have? Why should that be closed? Why should a view be imposed on a society or an individual or a family? And I think what they're kind of fighting, the sort of traditionalists, is a losing game, because the world isn't like this. We've talked about Roman times, we can talk about ancient Greek times, but what we're talking about are things that have always existed, that people's feelings for one another, whether it be sexual attraction, whether it be love, whether it be, that's what it's always been. And it's always run through humanity. It hasn't been a 20th century invention. It hasn't been a Western invention. It is what our society is made up of. It's a myriad of individuality. And these things sit in normality, as these people try to put it into an abnormality, in our humanity. And actually, we spend a lot of time getting sort of fussed about these things, when actually, we should be proud and celebrate all our humanity in our societies. And hate takes a lot of effort. It really does. I'm very proud of my brother, but we don't even think about my brother in his relationship with his partner any more than we think about my brother married to his wife. It's just how it is. This is our family. These are our family members. My own children. My goodness, you love your kids. Your kids are who they are. They're going to develop into their own individuals. If my daughter decided that she loved another woman, that would be her choice, and I would love my daughter absolutely no different than as long as that person was a decent person and it was somebody good in her life. And I think it does take a lot of time to change attitudes, and we understand older generations, this is different. But I think, my goodness, sometimes, I can't remember who said this quote now, maybe even Lenin, but sometimes nothing happens for years and then so many things happen in a short space of time. And I think that's where we are. And I understand also that that people find it difficult to see rapid change in society. And again, we go back to information, we go back to people having the ability to cope as just simple human beings with such transformation. But I think when we look at some of the hatred around the world, it isn't just about sexuality, we look at it about race. And we see that, I hate to say this, it's the ugly side of Eastern Europe for me. And we see that with football matches, with black players from the UK. We saw that in Hungary recently, where great footballers like Raheem Sterling or Marcus Rashford being abused, bananas thrown at them. That was 2020, 2021. That's the bit that I find really, really astonishing. But what we do know is that history's on our side, that they're on the wrong side of history on this. And this is unstoppable. And to be honest, it will run its course. And we saw the movements in the UK, in the USA, in the West, where actually this just came out of society as an issue. And it just found its place where we didn't even bat an eyelid any more than we would in a heterosexual relationship or whatever it may be. But it isn't, nobody's brainwashing or bringing in some nasty Western indoctrination of society. It exists. Love is love.
So to get back to our discussion, there is one more thing that that we're trying to discuss on these podcasts as to broaden the views of people. And one of the taboos of our society is drugs, and the bad thing is that we are discussing about drugs in plural, which is that there are actually many drugs, and from some point of view, some are very bad, like heroin, and some are fairly harmless, or so they say, marijuana. And then we have legal drugs, such as cigarettes or alcohol.
Yeah.
What's your view on the legalization of drugs, not just in Moldova, but just as a global citizen?
Well, as you said, it's more complex as a question, because you are looking at what effectively is something that causes an intoxication, causes an artificial sort of stimulant. And we can break that down into so many. If tobacco had been discovered now, it would be outlawed immediately. Societies wouldn't. I mean, the British were probably responsible, like they are for many things, for bringing that back from the New World. And James I thought it stunk even back then in the 1600s. But these are the kind of things. You look at alcoholism. You look at the prevalence of alcohol. So we can go very cultured with wine, and we can see that in cuisine, in French cuisine, or in Moldova produces amazing wines. And then we look at vodka, cheap vodka consumption in parts of, the former Soviet Union, or we see the UK has got a horrific reputation for alcoholism with beer.
You're going to get pretty drunk with wine as well.
Absolutely. And then you look at the knock-on effects from that. You look at men who drink a lot end up not bringing all their money home. They end up maybe in domestic violence situations. They end up in violent situations in football matches in the streets. So when you start to actually break these things down, and you actually look at the legal question of what will society tolerate, what is a sort of coffee is an awful addiction for many people. I'm not well, it's no surprise that I drink tea, and yes, tea with milk is the way to do it. We look at those things. In the US, I read a statistic this week, something like 2 in 5 white women are on prescribed antidepressants, which have a much more powerful effect. And I think there's a social stigma. We can all think of the horrific picture of the junkie and needles and backstreet alleys in some dirty European city. But actually, when we look at sort of the drug problem in the world that we have, and in particular around things like mental health, that creates a much bigger question of what we tolerate and what we don't tolerate, and what should be, how far does the state go to protect its citizens? Because the ultimate job of a state is to protect its citizens, and how much influence should that have, and that balance against the liberty of the citizen to be able to have some decision making over their lives. And I think that's where the question comes for me. I think there's been some societies, Holland is a really interesting, or the Netherlands is a really interesting case study for this, because many people think of Holland as the permissive society. But if you've been to Amsterdam, a red light district, you see the sort of marijuana cafes, and yet Holland, the Netherlands, is a really, really strong puritanical society. You go outside of Amsterdam, it's not like that. It's not sort of Dutch guys and Dutch women sort of, with no rules and all kind of things. And actually, they've tried to clamp down on these things more and tried to have some degree of control in this. Malta, I think today, has just become the first society in Europe to legalize marijuana. And that's an interesting test case to see what those effects will be. And again, depending on the science you read, does that have more or less effect than taking beer in a pub? And where do you get those degrees of what is dangerous to society and what isn't?
How much is too much?
And absolutely. And where do you bring in safeguards to protect citizens, to protect children, to actually have an education around these things? Because a lot of these things often don't accompany an education. When the drug campaigns in the US in the 1980s, led by, I think it was Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's first lady, the campaigns tend to be this notion of just say no, which sounds very powerful, but actually there's no education to why they should say no. So actually there's more an interest in trying these things because you're making it illegal or you're making it more sort of illicit. And
let's help the Mexican
absolutely, and society. I think what people also find very difficult is hypocrisy in this. And I don't know if there was a report in the British House of Commons where they found cocaine traces in the bathrooms of the members of Parliament. And some of the government people have had very well-known histories in their past as students of this. Bill Clinton famously wouldn't have the guts to say whether he inhaled or not at Oxford a marijuana cigarette. So I think it's a very good test case, and I don't think it's just drugs, that we look at how permissive our society should be and where that degree of control between the individual and the state should lie. And coupled to all of that is how we educate in all of this as well. Because again, my American colleagues would say they fear the drug revolution in prescribed drugs for mental illnesses more than they would with marijuana being legalized in states like Colorado.
Yeah, because those are very, very aggressive active substances.
There's a great article in New Yorker, that talks about that. You have your prescribed Prozac for your mental illness because whatever condition you've been prescribed, but then you can't sleep. So then you have a pill to help you sleep, and then you have too much energy, so you have a pill to have less energy, and then you don't have enough energy, so you have a pill. You end up then with a huge array of drugs, and the dependency, how is that any different from somebody with a marijuana habit or another habit? And yet it's more legalized and sanitized because of the way that it's being marketed to a white middle class audience, or that they used to call them mothers' little helpers in the 60s, when the height of Valium and things. And yet they're all drugs, they're all stimulants, they're all having a chemical effect on our brain, on our bodies. And I think there needs to be a bigger education around those type of things as well. So.
Right, because for example, the generation of my parents, they think that drugs are bad, which is fairly okay.
My parents the same.
But they don't know what drugs are. They think that drugs are just like syringes in, I don't know, in Absolutely. Eastern Europe used somewhere on photos. They don't know that there is LSD. They don't know about cocaine, about heroin, about marijuana, about spice, about glue, which is like mind-blowingly popular in poor circles in Chisinau, which is like stunning.
Absolutely. Well, you see vaping. Parents, concerned about cigarettes. It's not cigarettes. It's vaping. Vaping has had a huge popularity with young people across Europe.
And IQOS right now. Oh, well, and it's been on the market for several years, and you don't know what's the impact long term.
Well, I think these are the longitudinal studies that are needed when you make decisions. I mean, ultimately, go back to education. We want people to actually have some control over their lives and actually be able to, if you're going to make a decision, you make a decision that you can do it critically for yourself and be influenced. So again, back to the drugs are bad, drugs just say no. Those campaigns that America used in the 80s they failed spectacularly. They didn't persuade people because there was no education behind those things.
They just
there was
marketed the stuff.
absolutely, and then there was another side to that and a whole hypocrisy, which people soon pointed out and said, I remember people used to find out, did Queen Victoria have sort of marijuana to help with her period pains? And it's not proved or disproved, but the Victorians were very famous. Some writers, Sherlock Holmes, I can't think of his name right now. Arthur Conan Doyle. Laudanum was a very big sort of issue amongst the upper middle classes to take laudanum, and Sherlock Holmes in the character is a drug user.
Yeah.
And the recent one with Benedict Cumberbatch had him this way. It was cigarettes, I think, and nicotine patches. The British, of course, they fought wars against the Chinese to make them sell opium to peasants because of the markets of that. Some of the big, wonderful multi-million-pound historic houses in Bristol, all up on the hill in Clifton, they've come from the profits of slavery. They've come from tobacco, the Wills families. And it's an ugly part of history when people actually try to kind of, I'm talking in a general view, it's not my own personal view, but to moralize in a sense, but not actually connect that or actually be educated in some of the darker sides of history and where we are right now.
So as a follow-up question, what's your take on prostitution? Because it exists, it has existed from the dawn of history.
I think for somebody to make a choice in their lives that they would have to earn a living in this way, I think there's a strange glamorization. I think Pretty Woman probably made people feel that this was a sort of career choice, that this was a good choice. But at the end of the film, I think the friend goes to college and she marries Richard Gere. But I think if you think actually about what this entails, you think about the sexploitation. You think of a society like Moldova, where there is an issue with trafficking of women, of young girls. There's no glamour in these, but if you actually look at how the responses are to punishing these vulnerable people, these women, these girls, not the gangs, not the pimp, not the behind all of this. And actually, when you think about when we link that to how women are viewed and the violence against women, and you look at sort of how male attitudes towards women are formed from a young age, because the problem with our age with technology, of course, as we've talked about, is the availability of everything now. We never had that in history. Every piece of information, every image, every book, it's there. It's in our pockets on our phones, all right? Nobody carried the Alexandria Library before and more, the universe, in their back pocket as they went out for a beer. And we have got to somehow look at how male attitudes in particular are towards women. We have to look at when we deal with bigger problems, in particular with girls, about body image. We look at a narcissistic society. We look at not just having a mole removed or some sort of hair from a nostril or something, but when we look at people physically changing themselves to fit a stereotype of a male fantasy. And then you start to get away from an era of, okay, well, a woman has the right to do what she wants with her own body, or it's the oldest profession in the world. But actually, the darker side of that, I mean, you've travelled, that when you see sort of people in these cities, and there's not a happiness, there's no glamour to
There's misery.
Absolutely, sisters, daughters, whatever. It isn't about it's not moralizing the choice they've made to make a living. What it's doing is looking at what's exploited them to get them into that position. And often, the stories are pretty sad. And as we know from Eastern Europe, in cities like London, it's not the city is paved with gold or, a wonderful Cotswold tea room awaits them. It's a pretty seedy, nasty exploitation. And I think we worked with an amazing lawyer from our school who did a founder's lecture called Veronica Lupu. And she's done an amazing work as a human rights lawyer to go to the Middle East, to go to places, to get those girls back, to get them back to their families, to stop lads in these villages kind of preying on their fears, exploiting the weakness and the narcissism, but actually putting them in some pretty horrific situations which damages them for life. So I don't have a moral view in terms of, as a profession, whether there's a debate around how you legalize it, do you penalize the person selling, or do you penalise the person buying? But I do think there's a sort of certainly of a certain type of man, a certain age of a man, certain wealth of a man, who actually often has a family, often thinks his daughter's a princess, often thinks his wife, but to kind of
Hypocrisy again.
exactly to indulge in that and actually not realise what he's perpetuating as well. So I think that's for me. It's one of the worst blights of our age in terms of the way that women are treated and the way that their gender is continually violated, violence, the way that they're seen as second class in the minds of people, and it won't stop by sort of somehow okaying the idea that it's just buying a relationship, it's just buying some time, it's just buying. And I think that's the kind of that unfortunately is one of the dark sides of capitalism, not the great side of capitalism, where frankly anything is for sale as long as there's a profit and there's no humanity involved. So,
yeah. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the questions as well. Hope that was okay.
That was great.